Hello and welcome to our training on pathways to services and care. Today's training will provide an overview of the three main paths to services, which would be voluntary engagement, the care agreement, and the care plan. So today I will be joined by my colleague from HMA, Dr. Deborah Rose, who is a licensed clinical psychologist with a history of designing and scaling new initiatives in behavioral health services. So let's take a look at the agenda. We will be going over two main sections. So first, we're going to look at those paths to services and supports, look at the care process and where they would come into play, and talk about the main similarities and differences between those paths. And then the second section will focus on the care agreement and the care plan and what types of elements you would expect to see on those. So some learning objectives for today is that by the end of the session, you should have an increased ability to identify the points in the care process, describe the differences between voluntary engagement, care agreements, and care plans, identify some of the elements that would be included in these care agreements and care plans, and then describe some strategies for engaging the participant in the care planning process. So with that introduction, I'd love for Dr. Rose to join on and provide a little bit of introduction into these paths to services and supports in care. Dr. Rose?
Hey, Patricia, thanks for having me here today. Let's just jump into the content. Today, as Patricia just said, we're going to talk about three paths to services. We'll look at the voluntary agreement, which is a process that happens outside of the care court. We'll look at the court-approved care agreement, and then we'll look at the court-ordered care plan. And I see that we've jumped ahead, so let's take a look. As we do, we have to begin with an exemplar. This is a made-up scenario of somebody who may be familiar to you. She certainly may be like some of the individuals that we encounter in the care process. We've called this person Maria, and you can see by the slides that Maria is a 50-year-old single woman. English is not her first language. Spanish is her first language, and she prefers to communicate in Spanish when that's possible. She's living with a number of co-occurring diagnoses, including schizophrenia. She was diagnosed with it at the age of 24. She's living with unmanaged diabetes, and she also has intermittent alcohol use disorder. And so we think about those things in combination as part of a care package of treatment. Maria's parents are involved, and they're a great deal of support to her, but they're not willing to let her live in their house. So she is currently street homeless. She often stays in abandoned buildings or other places that she could find in town. And occasionally she will stay at a shelter for unhoused people. Currently, her situation is that although she's used mental health services in the past, she hasn't touched any services in the last few years, specifically in the last 4 years. She also doesn't seek out treatment for her diabetes other than when there's an acute episode, in which case she goes to an emergency department. Recently, she's had some altercations or some verbal assaults with people in her community, also with family, which is again part of why her parents aren't willing to let her live with them. And in the last year, she's had 3 arrests. Each of them have been under a month of incarceration. So none of them have led to long-term prison involvement. Her family is concerned about her, and her father has decided to pursue a care petition. So as we talk about the various paths to care services, I'll go back to Maria, and I'll ask you to consider her, and we'll use her as an example to illustrate some of the specifics.
Thanks, Deborah. So why don't we take a look at what this care process looks like and the paths that Maria might take as she gets connected to services and supports.
There are different ways that it can occur. We're going to talk through all of them. This is just really a high-level overview. The petition process begins, the care process begins when a petition is filed. So that means that an individual, an organization actually submits a petition to the court. Could be the county behavioral health agency, and that petition may be filed following a referral to the care program within the county BH. But again, it always begins with a petition, and that's what we're seeing on the left side of your screen. Generally, if it is a referral, The court will order the behavioral health agency to conduct an assessment of the individual and to begin engaging that person, outreach the person to try to involve the person in their own care. And then the case can continue throughout the process. And there's ongoing engagement, ongoing connection that occurs throughout. Really, the goal is always to connect people to services in their community. And you can find this workflow along with other information at some of the links that are on the bottom of your screen.
Thanks. So this is the overview of the process. Let's now look at 3 specific points in the care process, and then Deborah's going to walk us through what each of these paths would look like. So we're narrowing in on 3 different paths to services and supports that most people will fall into. You see that first path is through voluntary engagement. The second would be a care agreement, and the third, a care plan. So let's take a look at some of the specifics in these paths. So Deborah, talk to us about these 3 different paths.
Thanks, Patricia. And I will talk about each of them in far more detail as we continue. But this, we wanted to show you side by side so that you can compare and contrast. First is the voluntary engagement, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's voluntary. This means that early on, the county behavioral health agency has gone out to engage the person, to talk with them, to offer services that are really based on that individual's needs and preferences. And if those services are accepted voluntarily, if the individual says, I'm on board, this sounds right for me, then likely the case will be dismissed from the court. And those services and the community supports are provided outside of the care process. As we move forward, let's say the person isn't on board initially. We're looking at the middle box now. Then we'll move towards a care agreement. And in the care agreement, treatment, support services, which may be the same that are offered in a voluntary, those package of services are all going to happen within the oversight of the care court. So this means that all of the parties, meaning the respondent, the individual, if they have a volunteer supporter, their counsel, and the court are all in consensus, and that services will take place as has been highlighted, and that will occur under the care court, and the court will approve this voluntary care agreement with oversight. And then as we move along, perhaps the person is hesitant to accept services or to engage. Then there may be a care plan that is initiated, and this is under the court order process, where treatments, supports, services are all outlined. This can be based on input from all of the parties, but ultimately that care plan will be designed and approved by the care court. So that will identify those recovery supports that can be offered, and that will again be monitored and reviewed from the court process. So we're seeing this. Oh, sorry, Patricia. We're seeing this side-by-side process. I would say let's take a look at them each a little bit more in detail. So let's begin with voluntary engagement. That's that rectangle that is bolded out on your screen. Let's get into some of the details of it. With a voluntary engagement, and it's important that we note that engagement can occur throughout the entire process. It's not a one and done. We're hoping to always engage people that we are working with. What we're talking about here is that a petition has been filed on an individual, and that petition is submitted to the court for what is considered a prima facie determination. Prima facie, sometimes pronounced prima facie, means at first glance. And that is an opportunity that the court has to look at that petition, to review its components, and to make a determination that the person meets eligibility or may meet eligibility. It's a very low threshold to consider if the care process should continue. If that prima facie showing has been made, if it is an outside petitioner, meaning a non-county behavioral health agency petitioner, the court will order the county to assess the person, to help determine further if the person meets care eligibility, and to really try to provide services and identify a package of community supports that can assist the individual. The county will also report to the court on attempts to outreach and to engage. And if the person says, I'm on board or is interested in accepting those services and partnering for community supports, that care petition may be dismissed. So services would continue. If we're talking about Maria as an example, perhaps she would be offered some housing support, case management, medical services, behavioral health, or medication. Those can still occur and they can be done outside of the court oversight. I do want to note that if the county is the original petitioner, the court may not ask for a report or for further assessment. There's an assumption that they've done their homework a bit in the background and probably have already made outreach efforts and have probably already assessed that person's potential eligibility. The court can ask for that report, in which case they will order the county to provide some additional information if it's needed. So again, keeping Maria in mind here, if the county goes out, offers her these kinds of supports and services, and she accepts, then the process would end there. What happens though if, despite a number of diverse and assertive outreach efforts, Maria chooses not to accept services? Let's move forward to the next slide and see what might occur. Here in the middle of your screen, we're talking about a care agreement. It's the square that's highlighted or bolded. Let's get into that in a bit of detail. So in a care agreement, following the prima facie hearing, the court case would proceed. If the person has been deemed eligible or likely to meet care criteria, then the court will order the county to work with the individual and to create a care agreement. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as a voluntary settlement agreement, and that is put together for the court to approve at the case management hearing. The agreement is likely to include things like behavioral health services. It may include medication, housing, other social determinant supports that can be offered in the community, like food assistance, healthcare benefits, other things that folks together believe would help the individual to remain autonomous and to maintain recovery in the community. Many of the counties recognize that autonomy and it is essential and is a key component to having people engage in the services that they're part of. It really does empower individuals to become part of their own treatment plan, and it makes them experts in their own care. So many counties and individuals are approaching the care agreement as an opportunity to partner together. If a care agreement is reached, they will progress, and there must be at least one care review hearing within 60 days. Counties are opting in some cases to hold them more frequently and or more consistently afterwards, and that is certainly at a judge's discretion. And many of the counties and benches are finding that ongoing engagement is really essential to help people remain engaged in care. Now we're moving on to the third possible alternative, which is the care plan highlighted on your screen. We're going to jump into some detail now. If a care agreement can't be reached, the court will order the county behavioral health agency to conduct an assessment of the individual. This is referred to as a clinical evaluation. And in this case, a licensed behavioral health provider, sometimes a prescriber, meaning a physician, a psychiatrist, or an NP, will evaluate the individual and also look at the individual's ability or their capacity to consent to psychotropic medication. And so if we're thinking about Maria here, and she has not agreed to participate in some of the care services, again, the court will order her to be assessed, and they'll look at Maria's ability to accept or decline or consent to medications. In this situation, all of the parties would present elements that might be included in this package of services to be considered by the court. And together, the court will decide which elements should be identified and should be included in the care plan. And all of those elements would form this recovery package to help provide some stability and autonomy for the individual in the community. couple of things that I want to highlight here is that it's important to note that this care plan doesn't just hold the individual accountable to services, wouldn't hold just Maria accountable to services. It also holds the county accountable to provide those services. That's also the case with the care plan. I do want to note a few other things, that while the court can stipulate that medication be included on a care plan, this is a civil case, so there are no criminal penalties which will happen if Maria or if the respondent does not agree or does not comply with the medication order. It's possible that non-participation in a general care plan can be considered in future LPS proceedings if they occur, but medication non-adherence alone cannot be considered. A few other things, and I've talked a bit about autonomy and independence in recovery, is that we really are finding that like the care agreement, the care plan should take into account the individual's wishes, desires. Important to hear their voice and their choice of what's considered, what kind of housing if it's necessary, what types of meds if they are prescribed, what behavioral health services. And so all of that, again, is put together, ordered by the court, and that process continues with progress review hearings, which occur every 60 days. They can occur sooner at the court's discretion, but they are set at least a minimum of every 60 days. I also want to point out that there are some links on the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to know more about capacity and informed consent, you can click on one of those links to learn about that in the care process.
So thanks for walking through those, Deborah. We talked about those three main paths. I now wanted to just have a side-by-side comparison and compare some of the similarities and differences between the care agreement and the care plan. So can you walk us through that?
Ultimately, the services themselves can be the same, right? The idea is about connecting to somebody and providing a package of services that's designed for that individual. Maybe there is housing, maybe there's behavioral health services, care management services. We'll talk about some of those services in a moment. So the service package might look the same. The care agreement happens if the person doesn't voluntarily engage in services early on, but they are eligible for care. This means that the service package is going to be court approved and will be reviewed by the courts on a regular basis. If the individual, and let's go back to Maria as an example here, doesn't agree to the services that are recommended, those packages of services may be put together and it will include a court order to provide those services and to receive the services.
And then, as you're watching this training, if you have more questions about the differences between them or the parts in the process, you're welcome to email us at info@careup.org, and we can help connect you with services. So now we've looked at what that process would look like and how people might flow through the care process to receive those services and supports. Now let's look at what that might look like in terms of a care agreement or a care plan. So, Deborah, let's take a look. First, let's talk about who creates the care agreement and the care plan.
I like this illustration. I think it's very clear that there are a few parties that are involved in the making of the care agreement or the care plan. First should be Maria, of course, the respondent. She is provided free legal representation through care, so her attorney or the appointed attorney potentially will be involved. The County Behavioral Health Agency, if she has chosen a volunteer supporter, that individual might be involved. And together, folks will identify these, and I keep referring to a package of services. What's available in the community that could help her achieve and sustain recovery? That process and the development of those services should be done in collaboration with each other. It can be done early on in the process when they are making the county is making the initial outreach efforts. It will evolve through a care agreement or will continue to a care plan. Again, ultimately, if it is a care plan, individuals may propose different elements within those recovery supports, but ideally they will come together in a package of care that can be helpful to her.
So that's a little about who would contribute to the creation of a care agreement or care plan. Now let's take a look at what might be included. And you've referenced these, Deborah, throughout the different services, supports, the flexibility um, to provide the support that Maria needs for her recovery. Can you talk us through some of these elements that might be included?
Happy to. First, and I've said this before a couple times, that the care agreement and the care plan could look very similar. In fact, it may be identical in many ways. The services and supports, those recovery supports are identified for the individual. There's a little bit more flexibility in what could be included in a care agreement, namely because people are agreeing to the services. So kind of anything that fits the individual's needs that's appropriate under the county can be included in an agreement. Also, a care agreement can be modified over time or can be modified at the progress review hearing. So it's really an opportunity to tailor services to that individual. Certainly, behavioral health services, that could be mental health, could be substance use, include things like an FSP or a full service partnership or an ACT team, which is like a clinic on wheels that provides community treatment and support. It may include medication, psychotropic as well as other medication, housing that's funded by the community or by the county or other types of housing. It may include other funded social services. So when we think about people's basic needs like food, shelter, clothing, and then there can be other services that are available to some individuals. I mentioned earlier, so I'll repeat it here. I think it's important that under care, not only is the individual held accountable to partake in services and to participate, but the county is also held accountable to services. So this means that as long as the services are available in the county and are funded through the county needs to provide whatever appropriate services there are to that individual, whatever services are listed under the care agreement or the care plan. Last comment, and I want to highlight, is that one of the key things here, again, while the services and supports may be the same, again, the care agreement is court approved, whereas the care plan is court ordered. And so we just might see that subtle distinction. For more information, there's another link on the bottom of your screen. Let's jump forward. I've mentioned a couple of behavioral health services. I'll go over them again. Probably the most common ones that we'll see are, again, the behavioral health or substance use disorder services, perhaps treatment that's for people with co-occurring disorders. We will frequently see things like an ACT team. And again, that's a very comprehensive, assertive community treatment team, which has a set professional team that will go into the community and will work with the individual wherever they're at. The full service partnership, which is similar to an ACT team, meets the individual in a home, on the street, at a restaurant to provide a robust package of services. And case management, which is so important, which help essentially be a conductor in the orchestra to ensure that everyone is working together to support the individual in recovery. Peer services or the supports of people with lived experience of recovery is invaluable and is often included both at community behavioral health and often by the county behavioral health organization. So really that kind of mentorship, support and partnership has been a big part of this process. Medications, and I'll talk about meds in detail in a moment. Education and employment services, helping to give people live up to what they see as valuable in their life and productive, I think is an important part. Housing services, which we also have a dedicated slide on, and then other kinds of medical services and supports. So, and that can include access to things that offer food, nutrition, transportation. I think we can continue to talk about medication. Typically here, medications could include antipsychotic medications, and those are designed to help ameliorate some of the hallucinations, the delusions, this disorganized thinking. And if it's appropriate, if it's clinically appropriate, if it's desirable, a long-acting injectable may be considered. There may be other medications which are also included as part of stabilization. And so those are obviously individually tailored and recommended. We think that a shared decision-making approach and engaging the individual as an expert in their own care is really essential. That gives the person an opportunity to share what has worked in the past, what hasn't worked, potential side effects, risks, benefits, preferences. And so really working together to have an agreement on medication. It's not a one and done. This is an ongoing conversation, which should continue throughout one's care process and throughout one's recovery. Really, I think important to have the opportunity to educate the respondent as well as their supports on making medication recommendations. We've talked about the care agreement, and we've talked about the care plan. So a little bit more information on that is that medications can be included in a care agreement if all of the parties are agreeing, if the individual is responsive to taking medication. Medications can also be included in a care plan. It's a little bit more of a formal process. I said earlier that in this case, through the care plan process, the court will order the county behavioral health agency to utilize a licensed professional, often a prescriber, to assess the individual, including their capacity to consent to psychotropic medication. And so in that capacity evaluation, the professional will think about and will assess the person. Do they understand the risks and benefits of the meds? What are the risks and benefits of not taking medication? What's the purpose of the medication? That process will be submitted to the court. And if the court determines that the individual lacks capacity to consent to medication, they can essentially order the prescriber to prescribe that medication, which would be included on the court order for a care plan. Again, this is a civil process. So meds cannot be forcibly administered. Individuals have the right to decline medication. Medication non-adherence alone cannot be considered for any potential future LPS proceedings. But non-adherence to a care plan or non-participation in a care plan in general can be considered. And once more, because this is a civil process, there are no criminal penalties for an individual choosing not to adhere to a medication plan. I think we can continue and talk about a couple of the other services that may be included. To date, we've heard that many care respondents are housed in stable housing, but there are still many who are unhoused, either street homeless or at risk of losing housing. So certainly for some of those housing vulnerable folks, there are housing supports in place that can be included in a care agreement or a care plan, and that housing first is often an essential component of connecting somebody to wellness and recovery. Some of the typical housing supports that we're seeing is connecting somebody to permanent supported housing. There's interim and transitional housing, helping people to build those housing skills before they move toward independent housing. How do they maintain rent? How do they maintain an apartment? How are they getting along with neighbors or a landlord? So skill building as part of that housing process. There's also community-based housing. It could be an apartment that's next to yours or mine, and then certainly affordable housing. There's also behavioral health bridge housing, BB housing as it's referred to. And with behavioral health bridge housing, care respondents have been identified as priorities within the BB model. And so certainly that is a resource that's available, and really an invaluable resource that's available to folks who are unhoused. We include some WIC codes with examples of other housing. And so for more information, you can click those links at the bottom of your screen. And then we think about general social services and supports. And these are really all of those ancillary and wraparound things that are important for all of us to maintain independence in the community. These are things like income. These are things like nutrition, food, transportation, things that allow us to move autonomously and to maintain our daily lives. And so there are a number of programs that are called out in this care statute. Social Security supplement, income through that, Cal Works, Cal Food Assistance. These are a few examples. A care agreement or care plan isn't limited to those. There can be others that are highlighted in the statute. And those can include things like education or occupational support. So these will vary from county to county, and those that are listed on a care agreement or care plan will be those that are available in one's community. Again, more information at the bottom of your screen at that link.
So, Deborah, thanks for walking us through all of those different components that you may see in a care agreement or care plan. And maybe you could speak a little bit more about how you could individualize those services and supports for the needs of that care participant.
Essential to make all of these services and supports tailored to the individual, and to think about putting that person in the center of it all. What works for you might not work for me, and vice versa. So really stressing that the care plan and the care agreement be individualized to the person, tailored to that person's voice and choice, where we are thinking about the individual as experts in their own care. I want to start, I think it's an opportunity to really embrace and to consider that it's likely that most of the individuals that we are encountering have either experienced early trauma or later trauma, and to embrace a trauma-informed approach when we think about people who have been living with a significant mental illness. And so with all of that in mind, it's always important to think about individuals, their needs, their preferences, what are their goals? I heard it said the other day, and I thought it was really well said. We like to ask people what they want more of, what do they want less of? That's a great way to think about what matters to the person. What have they tried and have worked? What have they tried and haven't worked before? And so think about how they would use all of those questions to identify what's important to them as part of a care agreement or a care plan. Certainly, we think about the intersectionality of culture, of religion, of race, of environment, of gender identity, of family status, bringing that all together so that we recognize that people are unique. They each have their own strengths, and they each have their own desires for how they think they can achieve and maintain recovery.
So we've talked a lot about Maria throughout this training.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at how that that individualization might look like for Maria.
Thanks, Patricia. So we have a few examples here, and these are based on the scenario that we provided earlier. Maria prefers not to be in a clinic. She doesn't love being in closed spaces. And so we might think about an FSP team or an ACT team, which could go into the community and meet with her outside of the clinic's four walls. We know that she's been living with schizophrenia and alcohol use disorder. So we would think about putting together treatment and recovery supports that recognize both aspects that she's living with, people and services that are designed for people living with co-occurring conditions. She's had some interactions with, or unpleasant interactions with peers, with the police, with her family in the past. And so really approaching her, recognizing that services and outreach may be jarring for her, or triggering for her. And so we're putting on our trauma-informed principal hat and ensuring that we are approaching her with that in mind. Maria has a strong preference for individual therapy over group therapy, because group can be a little too much for her, having multiple people at once. I mentioned earlier that Spanish is her preferred language. So if we can identify services that can be offered in Spanish, will help engage her. And she's also had experience in the past where she has some religious preoccupation and some poor experiences in her life with earlier religious practices, and she prefers to engage in a treatment or a type of service that's not associated with a religious organization. And then finally, she's tried a number of medications in the past. Some of them have left her feeling groggy. Some have left her feeling too stimulated. Some of them she feels disconnected or heady. And so really important to connect with her on what has worked, what hasn't worked, what does she find to be helpful in her care. And so I think as we move forward, we could take a look at the next slide and think about, what does it mean for her? We mention here that Maria comes to this with an entire background of experience, and we want to ensure that we are building engagement in a way that is based on trust, that it's based on rapport, that's based on her strengths. There's a recognition of her voice and her choice in the services that are identified, and so we're constantly keeping that in mind. We are thinking about ways to approach her in a non-threatening and supportive way. And that might mean many, many visits. That may mean multiple outreach attempts. Sometimes it can begin with something as basic as a cup of coffee or a coat. Sometimes it's just sitting with the individual and being present and not expecting anything other than that 1 or 2 minute interaction, because even that brief interaction can be helpful to begin building rapport and trust with the person. That consistent outreach, despite the outcome, has a real value. A trauma-informed approach also is thinking about using motivational interviewing skills. I hear you, I understand, I'm reflecting it back, and using supported decision-making skills so that we can help identify what a person is voicing as important to them. And finally, it's important to remember cultural humility. I don't know your experience. I'm not pretending to know. Yours is yours, and I value it. And also understanding that somebody may have specific linguistic needs, and it will be helpful to recognize that in engaging a person. We do have a number of presentations done by an expert colleague on trauma-informed care and also on strategies for outreach and engagement. And so we have a number of links that are available for you as well.
And so thank you, Dr. Rose, for walking us through and helping us understand what could be included in a care agreement and care plan, and helping us understand how we can individualize those and reflect a trauma-informed approach to build that trust engagement. So, we've talked a lot about Maria, so just consider for a moment how you might support Maria in developing a care agreement and working toward a care plan if that's needed as well. And think about how you might individualize those care agreement or care plan for Maria's individual needs and preferences. So that is the content that we have for you, talking about, again, those 3 paths to services that in the care process: the voluntary engagement, the care agreement, and the care plan. So just as a reminder, let's take a look at those learning objectives. The goal is that you would better be able to identify those key points in the care process, including the care agreement and care plan, and describe the differences between voluntary engagement and the care agreement and care plan. Also identify the elements that could be included and describe engagement or strategies for engaging the participant into the care planning process and individualizing them for their unique needs and preferences, as Dr. Rose mentioned. We wanted to point out there are different ways that you can reach the HMA technical assistance team. You can go to the training library. There's a volunteer supporter toolkit for you if you are serving in that role. There's also a family resource guide for family members and other informal supports in place for people. And then also resources for petitioners, data collection and reporting, a county directory, FAQs, and other resources you can find on the CARE Act Resource Center. There are a number of ways to connect with us. So let's take a look. There's a listserv you can join to receive updates. You could also visit that website. request TA, request TA specific to data, could also provide just general feedback on care, and also our email address. So again, there really is no wrong door to connect with us. So go ahead and send us an email, visit the website, and if you need help connecting with a resource or answering a question, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.